Okay, so this is the Bible study for 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 6 through 25. And we've been in this study of 2 Samuel, but this is kind of the part of the story. Maybe there was one section before this on the death of Saul. But this is kind of the part of the story where 2 Samuel and First Chronicles start to parallel each other a little bit. And so what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to start including the text from First Chronicles in the study also, so that we can see that. Now, in our introductory Bible study, I think we talked about this, that First and Second Samuel were not only probably the same book originally and not really divided into two as those that organize the canon have decided to do, but probably it was also the same book with First and Second Kings. So First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings were basically one long story. First and Second Chronicles tend to parallel, at least a lot of times we think of them as paralleling First and Second Kings, and basically telling the same story. And these are basically the stories of the kings of Israel and Judah. And but First Chronicles actually starts during the time of Second Samuel, or the end of First Samuel. So we're gonna just try to pull that in. Our primary text for study is still going to be Second Samuel, but we're going to follow Second Samuel in order, but where the text in Second Samuel is paralleled with the text in First Chronicles, I'm going to try to include that because I think it gives us some extra information. In some cases, we have some extra information. In some cases, when you read the text in First Chronicles, you think, I think when they were putting together the story of one of these, they borrowed from the other, because sometimes the wording is almost identical. And so it was not uncommon for a writer that wrote one text for a particular purpose to tell a particular story to get some of the information from some of the chronicles or some of the records, the historical records, to include that in there. So anyway, it's possible that some of those are so identical or so similar, at least, that they may have been written by the same author and borrowed from one to add to the other. If you read the story of the death of Saul, it sounds very similar to the story that we have recorded in I think the end of First Samuel there. So that's what we're going to do, just so that you understand. So we have two texts for today, and I think I will read the First Chronicles text here at the beginning, along with the Samuel text, and we'll go through the study. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 6, it says, "The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, you will not get in here. Even the blind and lame can ward you off." They thought David could not get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. On that day, David had said, anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. That is why they say, the blind and lame will not enter this place. David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the city of David. He built up the area around it from the terraces inward, and he became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent envoys to David along with cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. Then David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. After he left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. These are the names of the children born to him there: Shemua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhiah, Elishama, Eliada, Eliphelet. Then when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went up in full force to search for him. But David heard about it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, shall I go and attack the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hands? The Lord answered him, go, for I will surely deliver the Philistines into your hands. So David went to Baal Perazim, and there he defeated them. He said, as waters break out, the Lord has broken out against my enemies before me. So that place was called Baal Perazim. The Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them off. Once more, the Philistines came up and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, and he answered, do not go straight up, but circle around behind them and attack them in front of the poplar trees. As soon as you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the poplar trees, move quickly, because that will mean the Lord has gone out in front of you to strike the Philistine army. So David did as the Lord commanded him and struck down the Philistine army all the way from Gibeon to Gezer. The Second Chronicles text in chapter 11, verses 4 through 9 says, David and all the Israelites marched to Jerusalem, that is Jebus. The Jebusites who lived there said to David, you will not get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. David had said, whoever leads the attack of the Jebusites will become commander-in-chief. Joab, son of Zeruiah, went up first, and so he received the command. David then took up residence in the fortress, and so it was called the city of David. He built up the city around it, from the terraces to the surrounding wall, while Joab restored the rest of the city. And David became more and more powerful because the Lord Almighty was with him. All right, remember that you can download PDF copies of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive so that you can follow along with us as we study questions and ask and answer questions about this text or these texts. Number 1 says, what happened in our last Bible study in 2 Samuel 4:1 through 5:4? A, when Ishbosheth heard about the death of Abner, he lost courage and all Israel became alarmed. That's true. That's the beginning of last week's text. B, 2 leaders of Ishbosheth's raiding bands murdered him in his inner room while he napped. That's true. C, they brought his head to David thinking he would be thankful. That's true. D, David had them killed and hung by the pool. That's true. And E, all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron to make him king over all Israel. If you missed last Bible study, if you did not read the last text, this is basically a summary of what happened last time. This is how we got from the point where Abner was murdered to the point where David is actually now king. And we see him acting as king in this text. So you would be confused about that if you missed the last Bible study. Number 2, what is happening now in 5, 6 through 8? A, David and his men marched to Jerusalem, also called Jebus, to attack the Jebusites. At this time, Jerusalem was occupied by the Jebusites because they had not entirely been driven out. See Judges 1:21. And I can pull that up just a little bit here, real quickly here. It says in 1:21 of Judges, the Benjamites, however, did not drive out the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. To this day, the Jebusites live there with the Benjamites. That is what we're talking about there. You can go back and read the story of Joshua and then in the Judges of Israel taking the land the promised land, and you'll find out that they did not all completely drive everybody out. So this is part of the problem, part of the reason that they're having so much problem with people fighting them within their sort of what we would consider their own borders. Um, I don't think nations had borders in that day the same way as we have borders. So um, we sort of had borders, and we know exactly where they are, and anything happening on our side of the border is we have it's sovereign land. It's our nation is in control of that, whereas some other country is in control of um, the other part of the land. That was never the case sort of before the modern era. Rather, kings ruled over whatever they could control, and that was kind of constantly in flux. And those kings sort of had leading cities, or maybe even just one city, and they controlled the area around it, however far their army was able to control. And if they did occupy multiple cities, then maybe they had control around each of the cities. But if another people group controlled a city right in the middle of what you would consider your territory, well, that was their territory right there in the middle. And that's kind of what was going on here. Is Israel had an inheritance. They had a land that was supposed to be their land, and sort of we have more or less borders described in scripture of what was supposed to be Israel's land. But because they didn't fully drive out the people that were living there, there were strongholds of other nations, of other people within their area. Reading some of the commentaries, it's significant. Hebron, uh, actually, if you go back to when they were taking the promised land, there were multiple kings in different areas, and Hebron and Jerusalem were both mentioned in the list of people that Israel was fighting to take the land. And those two cities, among others, had their own kings. Now, they obviously Israel controlled Hebron, and particularly since David had settled there and become king there. But Israel did not control Jerusalem. The Jebusites still lived there. And of course, since the Jebusites lived there, that was their capital city, and they called it Jebus. So probably Israel called it Jerusalem. And I was just gonna, the names of things mean something. Jerusalem means city of peace. And so that's what Jerusalem means. So we have a biblical record of Jerusalem all the way back early in the Old Testament, all the way back to Abraham, who most people believe that Melchizedek, king of Salem, that was Jerusalem that we were talking about. But really that means king of peace. Could have meant something else, but a lot of people believe that was the king of Jerusalem. Also priest of God Most High. That's the point of the story. Some people actually believe that he might have been God incarnate, Jesus, before the New Testament story of Jesus, and see Abraham's tithe to him as giving directly to God, because he was priest of God Most High. That may or may not be the case, but certainly Jesus is called a priest in the order of Melchizedek, meaning not in the Levitical order, but rather because he came from God or was anointed of God in a different way. So anyway, that's a lot of history that doesn't really pertain to this, but so this is Jerusalem, the home of the Jebusites, who called it Jebus and still occupied it. B, the Jebusites seem to be taunting David. They said, you will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off. The city was well fortified in a good position, making it an excellent capital. That and the fact that Israel had not driven them out before may have been the source of the Jebusites' arrogance. So the Jebusites were arrogant. They said, we don't even need our best army to fight you off. The blind and the lame can fight you off. And what they were saying was, because our city is impenetrable. And Jerusalem, set on a mountain or a hill, we would probably consider it a hill today as compared to our mountains, but it's sat on a hill with a fortress with walls around it, and probably it was one of the most well fortified cities in the entire world at the time, or at least in that area at the time. And that's one of the reasons why the Jebusites were still there, because they could easily defend and keep Israel from driving them out completely. And so when all of a sudden David becomes king, Saul hasn't driven them out. Nobody before has driven them out. But now David becomes king, and he comes and he's going to attack. And they say, you guys, you've never beat us before. You've never driven us out before. You can't get in here. We'll just wait you out, and you'll get tired and you'll go home eventually. If you try to get in here, we can have somebody sitting in a wheelchair on the wall, and they can just pick you off. Okay, they don't even have to go fight hand to hand. Okay, I mean, that's a modern, explanation of what they were saying, is that we don't even need that much of an army presence to fight you off, because the city itself is such a stronghold, such a fortress. So they called it the fortress. In this text, it was also called Mount Zion. In fact, that's the church that I grew up in, was Mount Zion Free Methodist Church, and it was named after this fortress. And so, interestingly, yeah, it's Jerusalem, but the significance of calling it Mount Zion was that this is first of all, it's on a mountain close to God, was the thinking. Second of all, it's on a mountain, and it's a fortress that is easily defended. And so being up here, at least from an Israelite perspective in the future, being up close to God, with God defending us in this holy city, was really, really significant, and carried more significance than just talking about Jerusalem as a city. It's a fortress, it's a mountain, it's it's a place where God protects us, and he dwells. Not when the Jebusites lived there. But you might understand why so many people have fought over this place for so long, and why different people have laid claim to it, because it didn't always belong to Israel. Obviously, none of that area did. It stopped belonging to Israel again, and then only really has belonged to Israel again, I think, since World War II. And anyway, that's another history lesson. C, the only way in was through the water shaft, and David taunted back a little, suggesting that it would be the blind and the lame who would be trying to fight them off. So they thought it was impenetrable. David had found a weakness. He said, we can't get in over the wall. They will have people in wheelchairs sitting up there, shooting at us or whatever, throwing stuff on us. But they have to get water. In fact, let me just say, the water it is a continual weakness of Jerusalem. It's pretty much the only weakness, but it's a continual weakness. because when the Babylonians came to take over, we find one of the kings walking along the pool. There was an inner pool and an outer pool that fed water into the city. And considering how he could shut down the outer pool, or arrange the water so that they could survive, but their water couldn't be poisoned or whatever, because the water, there was an outer place for it to come, and then it went in, and that's how water got to the city. And so basically the best way to access the city was the same way, the thing that couldn't be shut down, the water supply, the thing that they would need, that eventually, if you just laid siege to the city, that this water supply would run out. So the water supply had to continue, which left them vulnerable. So we find that Jerusalem, that continues to be a concern, even if perhaps they've found some ways to shut things down, or to adjust that in future days. But David knows that the way to get into the city is through the water shaft. And so he's not worried about them being so arrogant and thinking that it's defensible, because he knows the way in. And so then he kind of jabs that when we get in there, I guess we're going to find some people that fight us like they're lame or blind, because they're going to be surprised, and they're going to not be able to fight us the way a prepared military would have fought. So anyway, David knows a way in, and it tells us that David had already said, this is the way we're going to do it. We will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind, who are David's enemies. Number 3, what was the result according to 5, 9, and 10? And then also 1 Chronicles 11, 5, and 7 through 8. So 9 and 10 say, David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the city of David. He built up the area around it from the terraces inward, and he became more and more powerful because the Lord Almighty was with him. And then 1 Chronicles 11, 5 says, in the second part of 5 says, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. And then 7 and 8 says, David then took up residence in the fortress, so it was called the city of David. He built up the city around it from the terraces to the surrounding wall, while Joab restored the rest of the city. And David became more and more powerful because the Lord Almighty was with him. I was just going to see if I could pull up a picture to kind of illustrate obviously we don't have pictures of David's time. We have artist renderings and things like that, and then we have more modern pictures. But you can look up this fortress. You can look up pictures of Jerusalem, maps of Jerusalem. You can look it up on Google, and a lot of it will show you the modern day. But if you look at a map, you can see, okay, this is what it looks like now, but this is, the city still sits more or less on the same site. On the maps that I was looking at, the mountain was the oldest city. So the city grew out, as all cities have done. but it's really helpful to look at a picture of what Jerusalem looks like, because I think a lot of times, even when we're reading the story of Jesus in the Gospels in the New Testament, we don't know where the Mount of Olives is with respect to Jerusalem. But it's really just the next hill over, and there's a valley, but it's not that long a walk from one hill to the other, from the Mount of Olives to the city of Jerusalem. It's not that long a walk from Bethany to Jerusalem. And just seeing sort of the map and how things are laid out and what they're talking about when they're talking about these mountains, the Mount of Olives, and what they might have looked like in that day, what they look like now, is really, really helpful, I think, in helping us understand the distance, as well as sort of what they were talking about when they talked about the city. And the old part of the city was on this fortress, this mountain, and the newer parts of the city are on adjacent hills and kind of spread out. But the original city was, so David built it out, right? David expanded it, and made it closer to what it is, and surely not to what it is today, but it's just kept expanding. Number 3, what was the result according to 5, 9, and 10? That's what I read, that text. It says, David captured the fortress of Zion, which was the oldest part of the city and the most fortified. B, David took up residence in the fortress, and so it was called the city of David. And that's true. C, David built up the area around the fortress. That's true. D, David became more powerful. So in the end, they didn't think David could take the land, but David did. He definitely did. He showed them that he could. And it doesn't really tell us much about the battle that led to that. It just kind of tells us this is what happened. Number 4 says what happened next in 5, 11, and 12. It says, now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent envoys to David along with cedar logs and the carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a place for David, a palace for David. Then David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel. So Tyre was a neighboring town, essentially, sort of just right on the edge of what we would consider the nation of Israel, and probably was doing something for David, because David obviously could drive people out. David obviously could win battles that Saul couldn't win, and that Israel prior had not been able to win. So if you're a neighbor, you want to make peace. You want to be on good terms with David, not in such a way that he's going to come attack you next. So what did they do? They sent some of their natural resources, their cedar that they had, and their carpenters and masons, and they went up and they built a palace for David. Hey, we're your friend. We think you should be king. We're going to build you a palace. Please don't attack us. Please don't continue to expand your territory and take over us. And so that's probably what that was about. Number 5 says, what do we learn about David in 5, 13 through 16? So this is the part where we're like, this is the hard part to process. This is David taking more wives and more concubines. And we've talked about this already. And this was not uncommon for kings of that time, but may not necessarily have been the plan of God for the people of God. Doesn't seem like that's really what God intended for his people. And yet David seems to be, in that case, kind of following the way of the world and what kings did, as opposed to what God may have wanted for all of us. And I can just say, looking through scripture, there are other examples that we've brought up of people that had multiple wives. Certainly But it definitely seems like a New Testament teaching to say, no, that's not um, what God intended for us. It's not best for us. And that New Testament teaching goes back to Genesis and says, God made a man and he made a woman, and the man should leave his father and mother and be united with the woman, and that's the way that should be. Not multiple women in all of this. And the New Testament draws on Genesis to say this is really what we should have been doing all the time, despite these examples in the Old Testament of people that seem to be following God in a lot of other ways, but did not do it this way when it came to marriage. Number 6, what happens in 5:17 through 19? A, the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel. That's true. B, David went down to the stronghold. That's true. C, the Philistines spread out in the valley of Rephaim. That's true. D, David inquired of the Lord, shall I go to attack the Philistines? And that's true. And E, God answered, go, for I will surely deliver the Philistines into your hands. So God says, yes, go attack. This is what Saul couldn't get, right? Saul was asking. He wanted to hear from God. Samuel wouldn't come to him. That's why he went to the witch of Endor. He wanted God on his side in the battles, but God didn't speak to him. But when David goes to God, God does respond and says, I'm going with you, and I will deliver them in your hands. And then the second part of this question says, what was the result of this battle according to 5:20 and 21? It says, so David went to Baal Perazim, and there he defeated them. He said, as waters break out, the Lord has broken out against my enemies before me. So the place was called Baal Perazim, which means the Lord who breaks out. And so the Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them off. And we're not going to really talk about, we don't know in this text the purpose of why they carried them off. But it seems like maybe they shouldn't have carried them off. Maybe they should have been destroyed right there. I don't know. Maybe they will be destroyed. But I think in general in Israel, something always seems to go wrong when they end up with idols and things scattered about, even if they were plunders. So it makes me nervous when I read it for sure. Number 7, what happened in 5:22 through 25? It says, once more the Philistines came and spread out. So David inquired of the Lord. So this is a pattern. So I didn't really write a question that lists all of this all over again, but this is a pattern. They came again. He went to God again. This time God gave him a little bit more direct, sort of tactical way of attacking. He says, don't go straight up, but circle around and attack them. And then when you hear the marching in the tops of the trees, that's my army going before you, and then you go. And so it's very specific marching orders, so to speak, very specific way of attacking and having victory because God went before. Number 8 says, why is all this significant? Well, there's man, we could really talk for a while. Maybe it would be good in our Bible studies to go around the room and kind of say what it seems significant about this text to you. But as I look at it, I see, one, God answered, or God followed through on his promise. He has now made David king and established him. And it is, I was going to talk about this a little earlier. Hebron was on the outskirts, on the edge. It was sort of probably the closest major city or major kingdom city to where David had been. So he kind of went into, and one of the tribes occupied it, and that tribe made him king. But Jerusalem was much closer to the center of all of Israel. And also, so it was very strategic, more protected, less prone to attack from the Philistines, although obviously not without opportunities for attack. But it was central to the nation, which was important because it was more well protected. It was better for being king over all Israel, but also um, it was occupied by enemies who owned a city, ruled a city right in the middle of Israel. And so there were a lot of reasons why it was so important for David to take Israel. So God has fulfilled and placed David in uh, in the kingship as he promised, but also God has established his kingdom in Jerusalem, which, by the way, became the center of worship. It's where the temple was built. It became the most important thing. Jerusalem, when Israel went into exile and could not worship at Jerusalem, they felt like they couldn't worship at all. It became the most important city, not only militarily and as a capital, but as a center of worship. It became the city of David. It became the holy city, the city of God. Um, and so that's very significant. David defeats and wards off the Philistines on multiple occasions, and God is speaking to the leader of Israel again, which wasn't happening toward the end and probably majority of Saul's rule. But David is getting direction straight from God about how to win the battle when Saul couldn't hear from God and resorted to going to a witch. So there's so much significance in this text um, that God is kind of setting things up for the future. Um, Jerusalem um, does eventually get defeated on multiple occasions, um, but the kingdom is way more secure with David in the lead in Jerusalem than it ever has been before. And we'll see that not only in David's reign, but also in the reign of Solomon, where Israel becomes very prosperous because God has set this all up. And so this very significant moment. I'm not sure how many great spiritual truths are revealed in this story, like we might have in some, but this is a significant moment in history and in the plan of God for Israel and for David.